Hello, this is Karen Dudek-Brannan, and today I'm going to talk about an issue that comes up time after time for school SLPs, and that is our role in literacy intervention. Because although I don't like to admit it, there have been times throughout my career that I felt totally lost and confused about my role and exactly where I fit in. And if you've experienced this too, you know that feeling this way can make it really hard to do our job. So that's why I want to bring some clarity to this issue we've all faced at one time or another and possibly we might still be experiencing right now. Now, before I talk about how we can figure out just what we're supposed to be doing as SLPs working with school age students, let's talk a little bit about why you're watching right now so you can make sure this video applies to you. So, I'd be willing to guess if you're listening, you might be getting slammed with referrals left and right with students who just aren't making progress in reading. I'd also be willing to guess that you have students on your caseload who can't retain concepts across the board academically, so they're just really struggling in school. You also might have students who function poorly in the classroom because they can't understand some of the vocabulary in the academic tasks, so they're just really not functioning well across the day at all. Last, I'd be willing to guess that you might really want to help all of these students in these referrals that are coming to you, and you really just want to do your job well. But sometimes you feel so overwhelmed because language is so tricky and complex, and sometimes it can be really difficult to figure out where to start intervening. And what happens is sometimes we get overworked and are constantly second guessing ourselves because we're not exactly sure if we're doing exactly the right things. If you've ever felt this way or experienced any of these things, you're definitely not alone. I know I've experienced my fair share of frustrations treating this population. And when I really started thinking about this issue further, I realized that I was uncomfortable addressing language and literacy because, unlike some of the other populations and areas we treat, no one really gave us a standard protocol for delivering language interventions. It's such a nebulous area, there really isn't a quick and ready, cut and dry curriculum that we can use. Another issue is that language is messy. So even if we did know how to identify an area of deficit, it can be really difficult to tell how to hit the root cause of our students' issues. A lot of times, there are so many issues that we really don't know where to start, and we don't know how to fit it in the limited time that we have with our students. To make it even more confusing, it doesn't seem like we can get a straight answer from anyone about our role in academic or literacy interventions, no matter who you talk to, how many articles you read, or how many conferences you attend. So, there are so many different ideas out there that it can be really confusing, and sometimes we aren't exactly sure what we should be doing. As I've said before, if you've had these problems, you're not the only one. I was always unsure of what I was doing when I first started out, and language therapy was the least favorite thing about my job. That's why it's ironic that I'm here right now sharing this information with you. So let me pause and tell you a little bit about my background. My name is Karen Dudek-Brannan, and I've been an SLP in the school system since 2004. I've done a little bit of everything from school therapy to working in nursing homes with the geriatric populations, and have even done some private practice and taught college courses. But of all these things, the area that has left me the most perplexed was school aged language and literacy. So that's why I focused so intently on this area in my doctoral studies and research. And that's why now I run a website and teach online continuing education courses for SLPs to help other therapists tackle literacy and language intervention. Because over time, I stuck with it and I finally started to feel like I was cracking the code. So you can see the site URL here and my contact information. At the end of this presentation, I'll be sharing a free resource with you. But for now, let's get back to the issues. So let me talk a little bit about my journey in cracking the code and some of the referrals that I've gotten from teachers that led me to finding some of the solutions. So here's an example of a referral that kept coming my way in one way or another. I kept hearing teachers say things like, "This student's just not making progress in reading. The sentences don't make sense to him when he reads them. He forgets his sight words immediately. He just can't retain those concepts. And when I give you this quote, it's more of a compilation of a number of different things teachers have said to me. But one particular student comes to mind. I had a student who had been retained in first grade, and then in second grade, he still, after having been in first grade for 2 years, was not making progress. And the teacher told me that sometimes when he was talking, he would talk around words and he couldn't quite come up with the right word to say. And the way that the text was written, the structure of the sentences just didn't make sense to him, and he just couldn't comprehend it. That wasn't the first time I'd heard a teacher tell me that, and it definitely wasn't the last. Here's something else that teachers were saying to me. I'd get referrals, and teachers would say that students, again, would be talking around words. They couldn't quite think of what they wanted to say when they were explaining something, and when they were writing, they would just repeat the same vague words over and over again. Their sentences lacked detail, their writing lacked clarity, and they would use really ambiguous terms like stuff and things, and they just couldn't quite come up with the right vocabulary to explain what they were talking about. It wasn't just writing and expression. I had some teachers bring me referrals, and one specific case comes to mind when I mention this quote. There was a student who was about a year behind in reading, and she was getting no other special education services. And she would read stories and be participating in discussions and would have no clue what the story was about. There was one particular instance where the story was The Ghost in the Attic, and she didn't know what an attic was. So the whole thing just didn't make sense. And this happened time and time again with this particular student. But I also had a number of other cases that were similar, where these students were having significant issues with comprehension and they weren't making progress in reading, but it seemed to be tied to their knowledge of the content in the story. As I started to get similar referrals over and over again, I started to see a pattern. So these students, they didn't comprehend because they didn't understand the words, and they didn't know how to read the words, and they didn't know how to spell the words. And they also had a hard time understanding the way that words were used in a sentence because they didn't quite understand the sentence structure. And I realized that there was a similar theme to all of these cases, and that was that these students all had very weak vocabulary skills. Now, when I realized there was a pattern, I was really excited because I felt like I was finally onto something. But then I realized that the issue was more complex than I had initially thought. Because as I dug deeper, I realized that I had to revise my concept of what I meant when I said vocabulary. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean. So, what exactly do I mean when I say these students had weak vocabulary? Because I mentioned issues with word knowledge, but I also mentioned issues with syntax and with word use. So, what is vocabulary really? Well, first, if you have good vocabulary, you're able to describe what words mean. That's pretty obvious. You can explain what they mean. You can describe their features. You can remember the semantic features or the characteristics of words, and then you can use that information and apply it to being able to use words in different sentences. And when you recognize words in stories or in different situations, they make sense to you because you have knowledge of these semantic features. So these things all fall under the linguistic component of semantic knowledge. And that seems pretty obvious. This is what I thought initially when I would say this student has weak vocabulary. I was mainly focused on semantic knowledge. But then I realized that I was missing some things, and it actually involved some other components as well. So if it's not all about semantics, then what else is there? Well, we have to be able to use words across different contexts and with varying sentence structures. We have to be able to modify words by adding derivational and inflectional morphemes. And we have to understand the concept that words have different forms and functions. We also have to be able to make sense of sentences that have the word in different forms and functions. And when we recognize this word in oral and written language, we have to make sense of what we're hearing. So, what I'm talking about now are the linguistic components of both morphology and syntax, because knowing what a word means is not enough. We actually have to know what to do with the word. But we're not done yet because there's more to it than that. You see, if we can't say words, we're not going to use them. And if we don't use words, we're not going to have practice, which means that we're not going to have experience using the word, and our understanding of it is not going to be as solid. So we have to have a good phonological representation of a word. We have to know how to say it, and we have to know how it sounds so we can recognize it. We also have to have a good visual representation of the word in our mind, or an orthographic representation of a word. This means that we can produce it in print and we know how it looks in print, so that when we're reading, words make sense to us. Now I'm talking about the linguistic components of orthography in phonology. These five components that make up vocabulary are what I like to call the essential five: semantics, syntax, morphology, phonology, and orthography. These five linguistic skills are all interrelated. So each one of these things impacts our word knowledge and our ability to use words effectively across settings. I struggled in the beginning because I didn't understand how all of these components fit together to make up vocabulary knowledge. And I made a couple mistakes and fell prey to some misconceptions and myths that kept me from making the most progress with my students. One of those myths and misconceptions was that orthography and spelling is the teacher's job. Not realizing that this tied into vocabulary and that I could actually address this in therapy actually was holding me back. I also thought that vocabulary was only about semantics. So when I addressed word knowledge with students, I wasn't fully hitting all the components. That meant that I wasn't tying it together for them, and we were leaving out some critical information that could have helped them make progress. And last, I was kind of stuck, and I always thought that phonological knowledge was just a speech sound issue. I didn't realize how much it impacted vocabulary, which meant that I wasn't hitting this component as well. That also was holding me back. When I realized how these components fit together, I started to see some progress and I started to make sense of this. If you've ever thought these things or felt confused like I did, I want to share some insights that will help you along. So, first, let's address the issue of rule confusion, particularly with the area of literacy, spelling, and orthography. My first piece of advice is don't wait for someone to tell you your role. Decide what to do and just go do it. You're always better equipped than you think. SLPs are well trained to target some of those spelling and reading issues, even though sometimes we feel like that might be the teacher's job. But in some cases, we can take the reins for a certain kid, while other times we might hand the reins over to the teacher. I've consulted with both general and special education teachers on these issues, and sometimes we've had to sit down and problem solve to figure out who is working on what for individual cases based on who has the time and resources. When there's a student who has issues with language and they need specialized intervention in spelling, SLPs don't always have to be the ones working on all five of these components, but we need to make sure that someone is doing it. The important thing to know is that you can take responsibility for literacy interventions when the issues are language based, because you're actually one of the most qualified people because you've been trained to recognize these linguistic rules. And you might have a more trained ear or eye than other people. The point is that sometimes we hold back on addressing certain things in therapy, or we don't work on certain skills because we aren't sure what to do, or maybe we're waiting for someone to tell us what to do. Sometimes you need to just take your best guess and go with it. Just do something with all of those five factors in mind, and I promise you'll be helping your students. Don't wait for permission or get caught up in wondering what you should be doing, because no one's going to give you permission. Trust that you're well equipped to deal with these things, and it's okay to learn as you go and sometimes not be sure if you're doing the right thing. Now, another one of my issues again was that I thought vocabulary was just all about semantics. I didn't realize the global impact that it had across academic skills. So, here's another thing that helped when I was having a difficult time figuring out how to focus my therapy. So, an important thing for us to know is that a large portion of the language issues that our students are having are tied back to these components of vocabulary. And vocabulary is correlated with reading comprehension and is also predictive of reading abilities and academic performance. So, when students are better readers, they can also improve their vocabulary. So, there's a reciprocal relationship there. And obviously, if a student is struggling with reading, they're going to struggle globally across their academic careers. So, if we're having a hard time figuring out how to focus, something that we can do is make vocabulary our foundation. Because if you're hitting all five of those components, you're hitting one of the most critical factors that's holding them back from improving their academic performance. So if you make these five components the skeleton or almost like a curriculum for language therapy, you can know that you're hitting some of the most critical features that will help your students to make progress. The last sticking point for me had to do with phonological knowledge. So not only was I confused and didn't realize that there was more to vocabulary than semantics, I didn't realize what it meant for a student to have a good phonological representation of a word. What I mean when I say that is that students actually need practice using and saying a word before they really know it. Actually, saying a word and getting a good concept of the sounds that make up the word are critical for them to be able to learn how to use it and really know the word. So it's important that we remember this and remember to integrate all five components into therapy. Now, what I'll do now is tell you a little bit about how to do that. Now, I've said before that sometimes we want to delegate some of these responsibilities to make sure that they are covered in enough depth for our students to grasp them. But there are ways that you can make sure to incorporate all five components into your therapy. A little side note here, I have a course that includes about 5 hours worth of video that addresses ways to integrate these components. And even in those 5 hours, I still don't cover all the ways you can do it. So if you feel like these tips are just barely covering the tip of the iceberg, you're right. But having said that, I don't want to leave you hanging. So I want to give you some ways you can start integrating these components into therapy right away. So I'm going to give you a tip for each of those five components, and then I've included a printable resource for you at the end. And they're so simple that they almost seem too easy. For the area of semantics, one thing you can do right now is directly teach semantic features of words. This has been proven to increase vocabulary retention in young children. What I mean by this is that when you're working with words, you actually want to explain to students that there are different pieces of information that can help us understand what words mean. And then we want to tell them what those pieces of information, otherwise known as semantic features, are. So this could include things like the category of words, the function, physical features of words, word associations, or synonyms and antonyms. And that's not an exhaustive list, those are just some examples. It might not be enough to just explain word meanings. We actually need to give students the opportunity to explain words using these pieces of semantic information. When we draw students' attention to the fact that there are different features or characteristics we can use to explain words, then they're better able to retain words' meanings and organize information. If we don't pay explicit attention to semantic features and explain them directly, then what might happen is that the descriptions you get might lack diversity. For example, a student might get really good at naming functions, but they might not be able to think of anything else. So we want to encourage them to recall diverse semantic information. For morphology, we need to draw our students' attention to the morphemes in words and really study them. This includes morphemes that change the form, function, and class of words. The key is that we want our students to pay attention to the fact that we can actually change the meaning of a word or the sentence that the word is in by modifying the word itself. So this could include grammatical markers such as those that change verb tense or create plurals and possessives. You see that first example, I've changed the word imagine to imagined, so I've gone to the past tense by adding an ed at the end. Or this could also include morphemes that change the class of the word. So we've changed imagine, which is a verb, to imagination, which is a noun. So when students start to understand these rules, this is where they can get really flexible with how they use words, and this is how we get them to develop proficiency in actually using them. One of the best things you can do for syntax is simply practicing using robust vocabulary in sentences. Now, of course, you should probably include some explicit instruction specific to certain syntactic structures, but for the sake of this training, I'm going to keep it simple. And I'll tell you that if you are direct about explaining specific morphemes and semantic features, and you give your students a chance to actually put those words into sentences, they'll have many opportunities to use a bunch of different syntactic structures. So simply focusing on those pieces and adding the practice element is a good place to start right now. For phonology, I'm just going to keep it simple. Again, this applies to students who have vocabulary delays, and when you want to just add that phonological component to make sure that you're adding all the elements of vocabulary intervention. One of the easiest ways we can do that is simply giving them lots of opportunities to say the word. So when you introduce the word to them, have them repeat it back to you, and make sure you do that several times because students will develop a more solid understanding of what the word means and have a better representation of that word if they've had lots of opportunities to use it. For orthography, I'm also going to keep this pretty basic because I want this to be something you can do right away. Now, of course, if we have a student who has spelling issues, we should be explicitly teaching them phonics patterns. But if this is something that you want to hit right away when you are targeting vocabulary, one of the easiest things you can do is simply make sure you give students exposure to the words in print. Make sure that they're seeing it. Next, we can also make sure that we give them chance to create the word in print, so make sure that they're writing it. Now that we've covered all 5 components, we come to the next question. What words do we use? So if you followed my material at all, you know that I am a big proponent of Tier 2 vocabulary. So let me give you some background behind the theory of Tier 2 words. When we are directly targeting vocabulary in therapy, we want to make sure that we use high priority words because it's not possible for us to address every single word that our student needs to know. Instead, we have to make sure that the concepts that we address in therapy help our students to take that knowledge and apply it so that they're able to learn independently across other settings using the knowledge that we've given them. So when we choose words, we want to choose words that are difficult for them, obviously. It's not very helpful to target words that are pretty easy that they can probably figure out on their own. We also want to pick words that will increase their understanding of more complex concepts. Finally, we want to pick words that occur frequently across academic settings. If you use this criteria, you're probably using Tier 2 vocabulary. So this could include words like comprehend or summarize, or words that happen frequently across different settings and activities in school rather than just specific content areas. These will give us the biggest bang for our buck when we're doing vocabulary intervention. One of the best ways to find good Tier 2 vocabulary is to collaborate with teachers and also go through reading curriculums that your students are using. But that takes a lot of time. So, what I've done is I've gone through some standard elementary school curriculums and I've compiled a list of 30 Tier 2 words. There's 10 nouns, 10 verbs, and 10 adjectives. These are taken directly from K through 3 reading materials. So, if you're looking to start integrating some Tier 2 vocabulary using those 5 components that I covered in this video, and you aren't really sure where to start, I want to give you a leg up and start you off with some Tier 2 vocabulary that are aligned with most elementary curriculums. So if you want to get this list, all you need to do is click the link below the video and join my mailing list, and I will send it to you. And once you're on my mailing list, you'll also get other free articles and resources similar to this training and this free download. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope it helped you to find some clarity in your role in literacy and vocabulary intervention.